Well, I'm going to continue our discussion of modernist poetry, a couple of the poems we didn't get around to in class, and then we're going to also combine that with a short story by Dorothy Parker. And so I want to dive right back into Amy Lowell's The Sisters. We looked at the first half of it, and while we were looking at it, we were looking especially at what appeared to be kind of this contrast that Amy Lowell was putting together. She had talked about Sappho as being sort of this person that she idolized and would like to have hung out with as a poet, and could have learned a lot, and in fact she says she did learn a lot from her. But then she sets up this contrast between Dickinson and Browning. Now, if you don't know a lot about Emily Dickinson, American poet, Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, a British poet, both from the same period. They really were Victorians, okay? The Victorian era ran right around to the turn of the century, maybe a little bit past the turn of the century. I guess you could say that in 1901 or 1902, people were still Victorians, so, you know, the Victorian cutoff didn't come at the beginning of the new century. But they both very much wrote during the same sort of time period. Now, the question that we have is, why the contrast? She obviously does contrast, and we're going to look at some of the lines here. Why the contrast, and what are we supposed to glean from these lines where she offers the contrast? So, let's take a look again on page 516, where she says, "But I go dreaming on, in love with these my spiritual relations. I rather think I see myself walk up a flight of wooden steps and ring a bell and send a card to Miss Dickinson." So she's kind of thinking about, as a writer, as a poet, she's kind of thinking about who these people were and what it would have been like to know them and what she could learn from them as poets and as people, as intellectuals, okay? So she says, I'm going to, now in this part of the poem, I'm going to go visit Miss Dickinson for a moment, right? Now this, I well believe, I should have thought, is even better than Sappho. With Emily, you're really here, or never anywhere at all in range of mine. Wherefore, having begun in the strict center, we could slowly progress to various circumferences as we pleased. We could, but should we? That would quite depend on Emily. I think she'd be exacting, right? So if you've ever read any of Emily Dickinson's poetry, and we could have done it in this class, but we just didn't choose to do it. Emily Dickinson really likes to focus in her poetry on one particular object, one particular small, narrow, tiny thing, and then sort of moves out from that thing, talking about its implications and how that one thing is metaphorical and how it represents things that are bigger than itself, right? So she might focus in on like a moth or something like that, and then she kind of radiates out from that one object, that moth, to try to make connections with the rest of her life. And so she's very narrow, she's very precise, she's very particular and very singular, and therefore very methodical. She's quite consistent. All of her poems have the same structure, the same rhythm, the same rhyme. And so she's really precise. She does not write poems about, for example, broad sweeping issues. She doesn't do that. She sort of confines life to its smallest, most infinitesimal element, and then, beginning at that point, goes outward and upward from there, rather than trying to, you know, paint a very broad landscape, for example. So she says on 517, Sappho would speak, I think, quite openly, and Mrs. Browning guard a careful silence, but Emily would set doors ajar and slam them, and love you for your speed of observation. That's an interesting kind of thing. We ought to look at that carefully. Sappho would speak, I think, quite openly. That Sappho was sort of loud and proud and lived her life the way she wanted to and didn't care about anybody. And that has a certain merit to Lowell, to it, living your life that way. Browning guards a careful silence. You know, she's very reserved, she's very proper, she's very confined, she does not, she's kind of the opposite of Sappho in that way, in terms of her temperament. And, but to a degree that Lowell finds kind of suffocatingly confined. Emily, she says, would set doors ajar, meaning open them up and then slam them, and love you for your speed of observation. In other words, the kind of images, the kinds of metaphors, the kinds of objects in Dickinson's poetry are alarmingly and disturbingly profound. You know, it's kind of like the slam of a door when you see the connection between what she's trying to show you and what the implications of that small thing are for a broader context like your life, reality, God, the earth, whatever. It really wakes you up. it makes you think, and it almost scares you in a way. And she says, and she would love you for your speed of observation. In other words, if you got her poetry, she says, I can almost feel as though I'm reading the poem and I go, dang, man, that's a really good point. And you can almost feel Dickinson, although she's not really there, kind of there in spirit going, yeah, I like it, good, you got it. Right? So what she's getting at here, there are three really very different types of intellects and temperaments. And when she talks about the sisterhood, she's not talking about every woman writing poetry the same way. She's really talking about the diversity of intellects and temperaments, how extraordinarily unlike each is to me, she says. Everybody, all of these women are quite different. Sappho spent and gained, and Mrs. Browning, after a miser girlhood, cut the strings which tied her money bags and let them run. But Emily hoarded only giving herself to cold white paper. Okay, so each one of them is so different from me, but I can learn a lot from them. She says, at the bottom of 517, she says, whose fault? Why, let us say, to be consistent, Queen Victoria's. But really, not to overrate the Queen, I feel obliged to mention Martin Luther, and behind him the long line of church fathers who draped their prurience like a dirty cloth about the naked majesty of God. That's a really profound and kind of a profane image, right? In other words, she says, whose fault is it that people can't be themselves and be open who they are? And she's clearly hinting at her own sexuality, or the sexuality of people who are not heterosexual. She says, I feel obliged, in fixing blame, she says, to mention Martin Luther, and behind him the long line of church fathers who draped their prurience. Prurience is kind of like this sort of dirty-minded interest in something, like a dirty cloth about the naked majesty of God. In other words, it's not God that prohibits what we're inhibited by with regard to sexuality. According to Lowell, it's all of the church fathers who did all this. Make that as you will. Make of that as you will, but that's her perspective anyway. Goodbye, my sisters. All of you are great, and all of you are marvelously strange, and none of you has any word for me. I cannot write like you. I cannot think in terms of pagan or of Christian now. I only hope that possibly someday some other woman with an itch for writing may turn to me as I have turned to you, and chat with me a brief few minutes. Older sisters are very sobering things, she writes. No, you have not seemed strange to me, but near, frightfully near, and rather terrifying. I understand you all, for in myself is that presumption, yet indeed it's true. We are one family, and still my answer will not be any one of yours, I see. Well, never mind that now. Good night, good night. So she's talking about the relationship that spans backwards in time with her predecessors, and how she's going to be part of that longer chain of things. And she's got a particular take on it, I mean, like or dislike Amy Lowell on some of these issues. I think it would be rather hard to be coming off of the Victorian era. It really was an uptight era. It was morality cubed. There's no question about it, especially when it came to sexual matters. Whether you buy into what Lowell is saying or not, that's a different story. But certainly you can see her reaction as somebody coming off of the Victorian period, and certainly being outside of the mainstream in terms of her sexual preference, as someone who said, I feel a bond with other women who came before me, but at the same time, this is the first time I think someone has been able to be themselves since Sappho, if they were of that particular orientation. Now let's take a look for a moment also at Marianne Moore's poem, Silence. If we could find that really quickly, I'm turning to it. Moore, this is on page 587. The first one, very short, on silence. And this is really interesting because one of the things that you notice about modernism is there is among many modernist writers, and of course the classic example is Hemingway, but also with other aspects of modernism, the architecture, art movements like Cubism, where there's a desire to sort of reduce things down to their most basic and most essential elements. So down at the bottom of this screen, for example, you've got the Bauhaus architectural movement, sort of a German, also especially in modern day Israel, back in the 20s and 30s, the desire to create architecture that was new, innovative, avant-garde, all those kinds of things, but also dealing with sort of clean, straight lines, minimalists, just basic shapes. You see this, of course, with Cubism, that what we see as 3D reality has underneath it a sort of physical structure that can be reduced to sort of geometric lines, right? So it's a reductionism of sorts, if you want to see it that way, but I don't think in a negative way. But as I was saying in class, with Hemingway, people think, middle schoolers think, oh, I like Hemingway because he's really easy to understand. But why do you think so? Well, because it's easy to read. It's a lot of dialogue. Well, what you're not getting when you read Hemingway and you're just reading the dialogue is you're not filling in and coloring in the context. He makes you do that. He makes you work in that way. So Hemingway is actually somewhat harder, or it's more work for the reader. It's just that people who don't feel that it's more work aren't reading it attentively enough. So there's a kind of a quest among many people of the era in art, architecture, literature, music, towards a sort of minimalism or what I might call essentialism, trying to get things down to their most essential elements. Coming off of an era, Victorianism again, where decorative things were really big. I mean, if you walk into a Victorian home with a parlor, it would have been just like cram-packed full of stuff and little knickknacks and gewgaws, and the furniture was big and bulky and honky and all of that kind of stuff. And it's just, have you ever been in a Victorian home that's really furnished like a real Victorian home? It almost felt claustrophobic, like it was in need of a very big garage sale, honestly. And modernists don't want to do that. They want to go in a different direction. They want to sort of go with clean lines and very minimalist. So go and watch some 1930s films, for example. Some of those old black and white films where some of the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers films are fun. And don't look at the dancing. Look at the rooms. Look at the buildings. Look at that kind of stuff, because they're really trying to look very modern and modernist. And you'll see furniture that's kind of squarish and rectangularish with clean, long lines and sharp edges and sort of glass and brass. I mean, glass and steel and those kinds of things. That was really big because they were trying to reduce things down to their essential elements. Underneath all of the decoration, what's real about life? What can really be ascertained about life? And so when you read this poem on silence, it's about her father. It's about advice that her father gave her. That's Marianne Moore down in the bottom right-hand corner. And she was kind of a Grandma Moses of poetry. Everybody liked her. They thought she was filled with wisdom. But this is an interesting poem because it gets to a couple of things that if you're not careful, you won't catch, okay? My father used to say, superior people never make long visits, have to be shown Longfellow's grave or the glass flowers at Harvard, right? In other words, superior intellectual people don't need to have long visits. They can get what they need in terms of companionship with shorter, more substantive, more serious, more meaningful visits. You don't need to linger at somebody's house for 8 hours to get to know somebody, because they're, intellectually superior people can get to know you quickly, right? Get to the basics, the essentials, right? Like I said, they don't need to be shown Longfellow's grave or the glass flowers at Harvard. Now, she lived up in the Cambridge area for much of her life, and Longfellow and Harvard are up in that area, right? So when anybody comes to town, for example, you got guests over, it's like, well, let me go show you some of the things that everybody wants to see when they come to town. I'm going to go show you this or show you that. It's kind of like in DFW. It's like, well, let's go take my Polish cousins or my French friend from overseas over to the stockyards or Billy Bob's or, wherever, right? Some of the famous places that everybody from out of town wants to go see. She's saying that superior people don't need a tour of the town when they come visit you. They don't need to spend a lot of time with you. Self-reliant like the cat that takes its prey to privacy, the mouse's limp tail hanging like a shoelace from its mouth, they sometimes enjoy solitude. Now that's an interesting metaphor there in the middle. Self-reliant like the cat, they sometimes enjoy solitude. But the metaphor in the middle is really interesting. The cat that takes its prey to privacy, the mouse's limp tails hanging like a shoelace from its mouth. So a cat that goes and kills a mouse and doesn't need to show it off, even though a lot of them like to show you that they killed something. Self-reliant like the cat who goes and kills a mouse and eats it in private and you don't even know it ate it. Okay, they sometimes enjoy solitude and can be robbed of speech by speech which has delighted them. Right? So they're not big talkers. They're sometimes robbed of speech by speech which has delighted them. So in other words, they hear something, music or a speech or a poem or something like that, and they don't have a vocal response to it, because none is necessary. What was said and what they heard was sufficient. The deepest feeling always shows itself in silence, not in silence, but restraint, right? In other words, there's too much talking going on these days. Too many people talk, and people underappreciate people who receive, or the recipients of ideas and words, and who don't need much, right? You don't need much. You don't need a whole lot of decorative language. You don't need an extensive, lengthy conversation about things. Life is not something that you have to hear someone drone on about in order to understand it. You can be a participant in it without having much to say. And she says, nor was he insincere in saying, make my house your inn. Inns are not residences, right? He wasn't, my dad meant it when he said, make my house your hotel. You're welcome here anytime. But you always need to remember that hotels aren't your home, right? You're not welcome for that long, okay? Wonderful poem, and it really asks us to think about what can be communicated by not being said. What is it that can be communicated non-verbally? How do we understand things that aren't spoken? Because so much of what we know comes across non-verbally. This is why people often misunderstand one another when they write emails or texts or whatnot, because if there's no contextuality there, there's no contextuality there, then you can miss a lot of the message. How was it said? What did he look like when he said it? What tone of voice was it? What pace did he use when he said it? All these things are things that are in between the words, the lines, the syllables, and they mean things. So meaning doesn't have to be a long string of words. Meaning comes in bits and pieces in between the words. So again, a desire there for that sort of minimalist, reductionist sort of thing. Let's take a look quickly at poetry here. Her poem, written in 35. It's a poem about poetry, okay? And it's trying to define what it is and what it is not. And the big thing that you want to do is to understand that she's really searching for kind of a more modern understanding of what poetry is. I mean, everybody's talked about what poetry is for eons, right? What is poetry? Poetry is blah, 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 right? Even the ancients, the Greeks and Romans, wrote about what poetry is and what it is not. But she wants to say, now that we are where we are in history, in life, where we are in terms of the world and how it stands, and what living in a modern world with mechanization and industrialization and all of the things that go with it, good and bad. Now what for us today is poetry, right? And so she gets to this point towards the end of the poem that's very important, because she says she's searching for really a place for the genuine. And that's an interesting phrase. You have to make of it what you will, but we'll talk about that in a moment. She opens it. I'm just going to skip around a lot here. I too dislike it. Meaning poetry. I don't like poetry. Really? You're a poet, though. Yes, I dislike it. There are times and ways in which I dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle, right? After all, poetry's seen as being trivial. Most poets try to stamp their foot and pound the table and say, it's not trivial, it's important. But she actually is kind of saying, yeah, it kind of is when you think about it. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. In other words, even if you don't like poetry, even if you're irritated by poetry, even if you think poetry from time to time is like, this really is kind of a silly thing to do, trying to rhyme things and use words and play with words, because that's what it is, it's wordplay. It's really kind of a silly thing. But she says, but then when you actually read it, on the surface, it's kind of a silly activity to read or write poetry, but what happens is something really very profound, and that is, even if you hate it, you actually end up discovering in it a place for the genuine. This idea of the quest for genuineness, okay, is very important to the modernists. Remember, they want to punch through all the frill and the friff-raff and the fluff of life to get to the most essential elements. And so she's saying that's what poetry really needs to do. Poetry really ought to aim for, as the rhetorician would say, the logos, the idea, okay? She's not about ornament, as so many other poets are, right? She's about the idea, the concept, the meaning, the thought, the genuineness, the nugget of things, okay? She says, we do not admire what we cannot understand. That's a great line. I think it's absolutely true.
Think about it. We don't admire what we can't understand. I can't tell you how many times people have been to maybe museums or to concerts or maybe driven by a building that they thought was ugly or they didn't understand or they thought the music was horrible or that I don't get this piece of art, etc. And that's a thing that before you condemn a piece of art, you really should say to yourself in your head. You should say, do I not admire it simply because I cannot understand it? Or is it because it is really bad art? Because there's bad art, right? But she wants you to stop at mid-poem, almost midway in the poem, to say, now wait a minute, before you dismiss something, you need to ask yourself, am I dismissing it because it really is bad, or because I simply don't understand it? So then the question is, how does one get to an understanding of something? And then that is where she says we need to get deeper down into the most essential basic elements of the poem. Towards the last here, the last couple of lines, she says, in the meantime, if you demand on the one hand the raw material of poetry in all its rawness, and that which is on the other hand genuine, you are interested in poetry. Okay, so in other words, she says all this other stuff, that's all fine and dandy, but if you're the person who's really interested in poetry, if you're really a person who responds, sort of viscerally to poetry, who's drawn to poetry, who really appreciates poetry, who does her best to work and think about what does it mean. I don't want to dismiss this without trying to understand it. If you're that kind of person, this is what you demand. You demand, on the one hand, the raw material of poetry. In other words, it needs to be structured right and have those basic elements that make it work as a functional structure, right? And that would be, the form, right? The lines and the couplets and all of those things that the rhyme and the meter and all those things. So you want the rawness of poetry and all its rawness. That which, on the other hand, also you demand is the genuine. So it's a rawness, like the sounds need to be right? The sounds need to be real. They need to be what is raw in life, right? So you don't want to write about flowers if you're writing about death and cruelty. You need images that are cruel, raw. You need raw images to talk about raw things. If you're interested in poetry, you're the kind of person who's interested and okay with something being written in a raw fashion, right in your face, and one that strikes at some idea or concept that's truly genuine. Those are important things to her, right? That's what her quest is in poetry. We'll continue on in the next slide in the next video with Parker, and we'll take a look at some modernist fiction as well.